Oh, I'm not done videos for today. No, no, no. See, there's a madness video. This is kind of what I was going for, and in the end, it's not exactly perfect. So what I kind of wanted was to look at teams. So Vegas gets on the board because Vegas fans were upset when I did the Cinderella runs, and I tried to explain. Cinderella runs in the playoffs to me are that lower seed that goes on a run, that team that's on the road a bunch, goes on a run, and not so much a team that is just good during the year that we didn't expect it. So I wanted to do a board where we look at teams that were good when they wasn't necessarily expected, and this is again not perfect. I got every single year filled. It's not 100% perfect. Let's go through the notes. 1981, I like this one a lot. St. Louis had 107 points. They were second overall in the NHL. That was their first ever 100-point season in the NHL. And they made it to round 2 where they lost to the New York Rangers. Mike Liut, that was his big year. That was the year that he was absolutely stellar for St. Louis. So that one, big fan of. 1982, I had to hunt around in this one. In 1982, you know what I went with? I went with a Winnipeg team that finishes 500. Why? Because the year before they had 9 wins. So getting to 500 when you're wearing this jersey a year after having 9 wins is remarkable. They did get eliminated in the first round by the St. Louis Blues. But Winnipeg, that was a nice run. And it felt like Winnipeg was relevant. And that was important because the year before they were not relevant. They tied a lot of games though, so they still had points. Just they didn't win. Now for 1983... I went with the Chicago Blackhawks. 1982, the Hawks went pretty far in the playoffs, and clearly that helped them. That helped their confidence going to 82-83. They started the season 17-3-5 in their first 25 games. They had a pretty solid record. They made it all the way to the conference finals again, and they lost to the Edmonton Oilers. So the big difference between the 82 team and the 83 team for me is the regular season record. Chicago's regular season record was pretty good with a guy like Denny Savard up front and Murray Bannerman in net. Now for 1984, this is where I could have put Washington in 83, but I went with 84, and here's why. They started the season 0-7. So they started the season absolutely in the tank, and they still ended up 48-27-5, the best record the team ever had. This was with Rod Langway in the lineup, and they made it to round 2 where they lost to the New York Islanders in 1984. They did that again in 1987. The Washington Capitals' history of having issues in the playoffs is why people look at 2018 and go, well, they were a Cinderella team. No, they were just a team that forgot how to choke that year. And I can say that as somebody who's cheered for Washington in most of the series where they eventually get knocked out. 1985, Winnipeg shows up again. They set a record with 6 30-goal scorers that season, and they made it to round 2 where they lost to the Edmonton Oilers. If the Winnipeg Jets hadn't been stuck playing against the Flames and the Oilers, who knows? If they've been in the Norris Division that whole decade, who knows where they end up? Who knows what might have happened? But Winnipeg had a pretty good season that year, and so they're on the board twice. That's the reason I'm wearing my Winnipeg jersey. 1986, I went with Minnesota. Minnesota had 85 points that year, 80-game schedule, and remember, there were no 3-point games, so 85 points is respectable. And they had a round 1 loss to St. Louis. So the St. Louis Blues knocked off 2 of these teams so far on this board. So Minnesota, to me, is a decent pick. And again, if you look, a lot of these teams had a down year before, maybe had a down year after, and they just had this nice run in the middle that gets their fans kind of excited. And then 1986-87, so at the end of the 86-87 season, the Whalers get on the board. Yes. They were first in the Adams that year. Mike Liut had 31 wins, so teams he's on are up here twice, but they lost in the first round to Quebec. So they had a very good run during the regular season, and there was definitely some excitement around the Whalers. I was excited about the Whalers that year, and when it was Whalers and Nordiques, I just sit back and go, this is fine. This is good. And of course, that means it was, I believe, the Bruins and the Montreal Canadiens in 87 because they played each other every year. But yeah, so the Whalers lost to Quebec. 1988, I went with Detroit. Detroit was first in the Norris Division that year. They had 93 points, very respectable total, and they were starting to become the team that would eventually win a Stanley Cup in 97. You start seeing some actual success. So 83 and before, rough time for Detroit. Things start getting more serious in 88. And that success means that players won't be saying, I'm not playing for that team quite as often. They would lose in the conference final against Edmonton, which was your job. If you were the Norris Division winner, you were going to lose to Edmonton or Calgary. That's just how it worked. 1989, the Kings. So this works out really well for the Kings because this is where Gretzky's arrived. This is Gretzky's first year. That's the reason I used that logo on the board. They ended up having a pretty solid record. They made it to the second round. They played Calgary and they lost. But in round one, they knocked out the Edmonton Oilers. And that was a big series. I remember that series well. It was so weird to see Wayne Gretzky against the Edmonton Oilers, and that Wayne Gretzky helped to knock them out of the playoffs and spoil their chance at another Stanley Cup. 1990, a year that we see the Edmonton Oilers end up winning another Stanley Cup, the one without Gretzky. I didn't have them on the board because they were pretty good the year before. But Toronto had a 500 record. And this was a team that was so miserable for most of the decade. That 500 record was respectable. That 500 record was good, and then they lost in round one against St. Louis. So St. Louis, again, is a team that's knocking out these I guess we can still call them Cinderella stories, but it's more like the unexpected. As nobody was looking at the 89-90 Maple Leafs and going, that's going to be good. And you know what? Gary Leeman's going to get 50 goals. He did that year. Gary Leeman had 50 goals. St. Louis gets back on the board in 1991, and it's their second and last time on the board. This was the year that Brett Hull had 86 goals, and Adam Oates set up pretty darn near every one of them. They would get to round two. They would lose to the Minnesota North Stars in round two. So 1991 was the year that Minnesota said, we're going to the finals even though our record is garbage, and St. Louis fell by the wayside. So this is where it's different. The video that I did a few days back talking about your lower ranked teams going on these Cinderella runs, so Minnesota gets on the board for that. St. Louis was a good team all year that really did well and ended up losing to the Minnesota North Stars in the second round of the playoffs. So it's a little bit of a different criteria I used, even though there are some teams that double up on here. 1992, Vancouver Canucks. First in their division, 96 points. Bure's rookie year, they lost in round two against Edmonton. They beat Winnipeg in round one and then lost to the Edmonton Oilers. And that was an opportunity lost for Vancouver potentially. But after years and years and years of being a doormat, the Vancouver Canucks were finally relevant. And it felt nice. 1993, Quebec. The Quebec Nordiques make the playoffs for the first time since 1987 in a rebuild that felt like it was taking forever. And their shooting percentage was 13.9. They had 104 points, and then they lost in round one against Montreal. So it looked like they were going to steamroll Montreal, and that was what was expected after the first couple of games. And then I guess Montreal looked at that and went, nah. Patrick Roy probably looked at that and went, nah, that's cute, but we're not getting steamrolled. We're gonna win this series, and then they did. 1994 Rangers. The New York Rangers by this point were kind of I'm not going to say a joke, but there were certainly some laughs being had at their expense before the 1994 Stanley Cup run. So even though they had 112 points that year, there were certainly those that were saying to themselves, I'll believe it when I see it. This is a team that's found a way to lose since 1940, and they'll just find a way to lose again. Richter had 42 wins during the regular season, and they did win the Stanley Cup to silence their critics and make Messier even more of a legend with his 6th Stanley Cup ring. 1995, I went with the Philadelphia Flyers. This was the year Lindros had 70 points, and they went to the conference finals against New Jersey. This, of course, is a lockout-shortened season. That's the reason 70 points is substantial, because he only played 48 games. Or in Lindros' case, it was 46. Yager won the Art Ross, but he played 48. So, yeah, I have the Flyers up there for 95. So if you're a Flyers fan, good news. This is one case where there's only one Flyers logo on the board. So you guys shouldn't feel like I'm picking on you. 1996, Montreal. So here's the thing. I'm looking through all of these numbers on the seasons. And 96, it's the end of the Montreal Forum. Patrick Roy gets traded. At the time Roy's traded, the team has a 12-11-1 record. After he left, by the end of the year, their record is 40-32-10. The record was better after trading Patrick Roy than it was before they traded Patrick Roy. They lost in round 1 to the New York Rangers, but really, in all honesty, it's very interesting that the Montreal Canadiens record was better after they traded Roy, because of course we all look back at that time and say that was so stupid. Mario Tremblay, what was he thinking? And Ron Caron, and this is just what a horribly run franchise. With Thibault as their goaltender, they actually had a better record. So I understand it's not because of Patrick Roy, but it's interesting. So for that reason, I have them up there as the 96 team, because you wouldn't expect their record to get better without Patrick. 1997, the Anaheim Ducks. First time they made it to the playoffs. If you're looking for the Sharks on this board, the reality is the Sharks got up here as Cinderella teams in the playoffs, but during the regular season, the results were kind of pedestrian. And so Anaheim gets in here with their first playoffs. Solani, 51 goals and 58 assists that season, and they went to round 2 where they lost to the Detroit Red Wings. 1998, I went with the Kings. They had 87 points. Stéphane Fiset was their starting goaltender. 26-25-8 record. They would lose in round 1 against the St. Louis Blues. But a very good season for the LA Kings. An unremarkable team that did play pretty well. 1999, Buffalo. So Buffalo was on the board when I talked about Cinderella runs. They're on the board here too. Shaitan had 40 goals. Hasek, a 1.87 goals against average. And they rode that to the Stanley Cup Finals. And he was solid all year. He dragged that team to results that I didn't expect. And I don't know if Buffalo fans are going to say, well, you can't put us up there for both. But to me, their record was better than it should have been because they had Hasek in the net. Florida gets up there in 2000. So this is a difference as well. 96, they had the playoff run. But in 2000, they had 98 points, which was unexpected. They were second in the Southeast behind the Washington Capitals. And they lost in round 1 against New Jersey. Florida's had some good years. They just haven't had any playoff success since 96. 2001, Buffalo's back on the board with 98 points. 98 points for these guys. They got to round 2, and against Pittsburgh, they lost in 7. So they gave Pittsburgh a good run in 2001. And who knows if they got past Pittsburgh, right? There's a lot of who knows, what if, maybe for Buffalo fans. Believe me, as a Canucks fan, I get it. 2002, I went with Chicago. This was their first playoff appearance since 1997. They only made it to the first round. They lost to St. Louis. So St. Louis has managed to take out some of these teams in the playoffs. You got one here. That's 3, 4. It's 4 times so far for St. Louis? Yeah, 4 times for St. Louis so far. We'll see how many they have by the end of this. But they took out Chicago in 2002 in a rivalry that Chicago fans are well aware of. 2003, Minnesota. So the Anaheim Ducks go to the Stanley Cup Finals, but honestly, Minnesota's 95-point season is kind of more surprising, and it's a really solid year they put together with Jacques Lemaire strangling the life out of hockey as we know it, but it worked. So they got to round 3. They did lose to the Anaheim Ducks in a very slow, methodical series where every game, both teams were waiting for the other one to make a mistake. But I have to give Minnesota props for having a really good year where it wasn't expected. 95 points for them. 2004, Boston gets on the board for the first of 2 appearances that they have. For the Boston Bruins, it was a 104-point season. And if you're going to say, well, that's not that impressive. Yeah, Andrew Raycroft was the goaltender, record of 29-18-9. He'll go to Toronto and do some special things. Round 1, they lost against Montreal. So that's how it works, and that's why we can't have nice things. 2006, so of course 2005, the big storyline there is the lockout. 2006, the Carolina Hurricanes win the Cup. I can't not have them up here. They had a record of 52-22-8. Where did that come from? And there were certainly people at the time that said, well, their division's weak. Yeah, they won 52 games. It's more than just a weak division when you win 52 games. And of course, they win the Cup. Cam Ward wins the Conn Smythe Trophy. And this team is just one giant feel-good story in Carolina. And it was quite a run all year. The funny part being that going into the playoffs, even though they had those 52 wins, they still weren't taking that seriously. It was kind of we'll see. They're the Southeast Division winners, so how good can they be? Yeah, they turned out to be pretty good. 2007, Nashville. Nashville went for it. This team absolutely went for it. 51-23-8 record, and they brought in Peter Forsberg. And it wasn't, Forsberg in his prime or anything, but they gave it a shot. And I honestly, I credit Nashville for going in on the deadline and deciding, okay, we're going to try to win a round. They would lose in round one against San Jose, but it was a hard luck series, and that was an impressive little run for Nashville all year. It was a surprise to see them with 51 wins at the end of the year. Now, Montreal's back on the board in 2008 with their first division title since 1992. And they get to round two where they lose to the Philadelphia Flyers. So for Montreal, the division win doesn't do a whole lot when you lose in round two. But still, the division win, it's important because they weren't expected to win the division that year. 2009, now it's Boston back in the unexpected category. Tim Thomas had .933 as a save percentage. Mark Savard, 88 points to lead the team in scoring, but in the playoffs they would be upset by the Carolina Hurricanes in round two. But it was a very good season put together by the Boston Bruins. Tim Thomas really arrived as the starting goaltender, and we got a glimpse of just how good he would be in 2011 with his play in 2009, and then in between you have 2010, which I don't really talk about a whole lot as a Bruins fan. But Mark Savard is the leading scorer. I had to put them up there. 2010, Arizona. Now, keep in mind, Arizona, there's all kinds of rumblings about Jim Balsillie coming in to buy the team and move it to Hamilton. And it almost happened, but then it didn't because the NHL didn't want that to happen. They wanted this team to stay in Arizona. They didn't want the team to get moved to Hamilton. I don't think they trusted Jim Balsillie either, or Balsley. Balsley just sounds weird, but I don't think they trusted him. I think they looked at him and they went, it kind of reminds us of when a guy bought the Islanders and then he had no money. So that was kind of the feeling I got, was that they didn't trust him because he wasn't going about it the way they'd want him to if he wanted to buy and move a team. So they ended up with a record of 50-25-7. Full-on respect for a team that's got a cloud hanging over it to win 50 games. Now, they lost in round one against Detroit, but I remember that being a pretty hard-fought series. Arizona has had some hard-fought series along the way. 2012 comes to mind, as well as 2010. 2011, here's where Tampa shows up. So Tampa fans were upset that I didn't have them as the team that I had for the Cinderella team in 2011, but I didn't see them as a pure Cinderella team because they had 46 wins, 25 losses, and 11 ties or overtime losses as well. So that's 103 points. It's hard to rule a Cinderella run in the playoffs when you come into the playoffs with 103 points, but you can have them on the board as an unexpected complete season run. They would lose in round three against Boston in a very unusual manner in that their power play was deadly. So in Game 7, Boston just didn't take a penalty, and Tampa fans had a meltdown. Hockey fans in general had a meltdown that there wasn't a single penalty in that game. I thought it was just a very clean game. I didn't see a penalty that I thought should have been called, but I understood why people were upset because it did look kind of sort of suspicious that Tampa's power play was lethal, and so Boston didn't take a single penalty in the game. But yeah, and that was definitely a narrative, and I'm sure Tampa fans won't be happy I just brought it up. 2012, it is New Jersey. It has to be New Jersey. They had a penalty killing that year of 89.58%. Fantastic numbers. They ended up being 48-28-6. This was that last year, the last hurrah from Marty Brodeur, and they did go to the finals and lost in 6 against the LA Kings. And they showed some fight back against the Kings, made it tough for them to finally close it out, but LA eventually would. Now, 2013, Toronto. First playoffs for Toronto since 2004. And then they lost in round one against Boston, and of course it was the famous meltdown by James Reimer, but it was the whole Leafs, it wasn't just Reimer. It's sort of like Jake Gardiner taking all the credit and blame for the losses for Toronto. And it's not just Gardner. Well, it wasn't just Reimer either. There were certainly some defensive lapses that led to the goals Boston had in that comeback. But, it was still a really good run for Toronto, and it was unexpected. Now, the one thing that I heard a lot coming out of that series and that season was, well, the Leafs made it because it was a shortened schedule. If it was a full 82 games, they would have missed. So when I hear people talking about this year, if we see playoffs, there's going to be an asterisk. People put an asterisk next to that. That asterisk doesn't last. As years go by, you just sort of forget about it. And you're like, oh, yeah, Toronto made the playoffs. And you don't think, well, yeah, but it was only a 48-game schedule. Colorado I've got for 2014. They were not an analytics darling. So when they failed in round one against Minnesota, all the analytics people went, see, we told you they weren't any good. But you kind of got the feeling it made them nervous because all the analytics data told you Colorado was lousy, and yet they just kept going out there and winning. This was their first playoffs since 2010. And then they didn't make it past the Minnesota Wild in round one, and all the analytics people took a deep breath and let out a sigh of relief. It was weird to me. And it was really weird to me to see analytics community coming together going, those guys are frauds. They have to lose in round one. 2015, I went with Vancouver. So there were a few options for 2015. I went with Vancouver because nobody saw them coming back from the dead when they hired Willie Desjardins to come in behind the bench. I mean, I expected something of a bounce back after the Tortorella season that was a mess, but I didn't expect playoffs. They ended up 48, 29, and 5. This is Bo Horvat's rookie year, and then they lost in round one against Calgary. So once the playoffs rolled around, much like Colorado the year before, it kind of felt like Vancouver was exposed, and Calgary took them out. But that's what Calgary does. So at some point we'll get to the Calgary-Vancouver rivalry on the rivalries playlist, and you'll see Calgary has their way with Vancouver. Even though Vancouver can point to 82 and 94 and go, see, we went to the finals those years. Yeah, but in general, Calgary's been pretty good against Vancouver in the playoffs. 2016, Dallas. They finished second overall that year. 50, 23, and 9. Nobody expected 109 points from Dallas. And they lost in round two against St. Louis. And where I knew they had a problem was with Lehtinen and Niemi. And no matter how many games they won that year, I still said, but I don't trust their goaltending. And against St. Louis, it finally completely fell apart. And because neither goaltender could have two good games in a row. And that was the narrative that was there, and it was painful. Where Dallas could score, but they couldn't get two good games in a row out of either goaltender. And it would always be, Lehtinen would have a bad game, Niemi would go into relief and look pretty good, and then you'd hear, Dallas feels pretty confident in Niemi. They're going to go with Niemi from here. And then Niemi would go out, allow 5 goals on 4 shots, somehow. Lehtinen would go in and hear, Dallas is pretty confident in Lehtinen. Meanwhile, I'm taking all my Dallas gear and saying, well, I can wear this next season, because, yeah. So that's how that was going. 2017, Oilers. The Oilers, who came out of nowhere and then went back. So they made the playoffs 47, 26, and 9, and Oilers and Leaf fans in 2017 were having legitimate conversations about how many cups their teams were going to win. Which team's going to win more cups, the Oilers or the Leafs? And nobody was really laughing at it because both franchises appeared to be on their way to some tremendous success. And I was kind of leaning towards the Oilers, but I could understand the argument for the Leafs, and it was kind of a fun conversation to have. And now here we are a few years later, and I don't know, are either team close to a cup? But anyways, this year they went to round 2 and they lost to Anaheim. There was that controversial play with Ryan Kessler that fans in Edmonton didn't like. I didn't like it either. McDavid had 30 goals and 70 assists for 100 points. And Cam Talbot had a .919 save percentage. Talbot was fantastic that year. I was sold on Talbot, and then 2018 came along, and then they sold Talbot. 2018, it is Vegas. 109 points. Right out of the gate, right from day one, Vegas made it clear we are not an expansion team. They didn't use that term. They called themselves the Golden Misfits, and they certainly all rallied around the idea that they were cast-offs from other organizations. But Vegas was not a true expansion team. They set North American records for being the best expansion team ever. I expect Seattle to end up being the second best expansion team ever. I would not be surprised to see a team in Seattle in 2021, 2022 end up with 100 points. It would not surprise me. If Ron Francis can do what George McPhee did, he's going to have access to some fantastic players. It is possible with the right chemistry and the right voice behind the bench that we could see a similar, not quite as stellar run from Seattle in a year's time as we saw from Vegas in 2018. It was a great run. 109 points, and then they went all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals against Washington. But by the time the playoffs rolled around, we knew Vegas was good. And so after they took out LA in the first round, and I did take LA, full disclosure, I took LA to win that round. After that, I had no doubt about them at all. In fact, I took them to win the Stanley Cup over Washington. I felt that they would beat Washington in the finals. And then Washington, with cross-crease passes, was able to get around all of the wonders that Vegas had put together. And those cross-crease passes finally did them in. But it was a great run for Vegas. Again, by the time the playoffs roll around, you have 109 points. It's not really exactly Cinderella, but that entire season is an unexpected season. 2019, the unexpected season is Calgary's. 107 points. They end up first in the West for the first time since 89-90. All the way back here, the last time that they were first in the West. That's a lot of years in between. And they lost in round one against Colorado. So it's odd that here was Colorado, a team that came out of nowhere, and they lose in round one against Minnesota. And now here's a team that kind of came out of nowhere in Calgary and lost in round one against Colorado. And a lot of the same things were said about Calgary that were said about Colorado. Not the analytics side, but the idea of, okay, we knew they were overachieving. This is more of who they are. And yeah, Colorado came out and proved that Calgary's not that special. Now, the challenge for the Flames going forward, whether we have a remainder of 2020 season or not, is to prove when we get back on the ice that they are the real deal and that this wasn't just a fluke. Because if they end up missing the playoffs, if they end up getting swept in the first round as a wild card, definitely that will add to the narrative that this looked like a fluke. But let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. As always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. I told you guys it was madness. I told you it was on the way. And thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.